Start recording. Okay. As I mentioned, Professor Serhii Plokhii is the Mikhailo S. Grushevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. His interests include the intellectual, cultural, and international history of Eastern Europe, with an emphasis on Ukraine. He grew up in Zaporizhia. He attended the University of Dnipropetrovsk and received his habilitation degree, so in other words, his second PhD, from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv when he was only 32 years old. Professor Plokhii is the author of many, many books, and I'm just going to give a very incomplete list, which would include The Cossacks and Religion in Early Modern Ukraine from Oxford in 2001, Unmaking Imperial Russia, Mikhailo Grushevsky and the Writing of Ukrainian History from the University of Toronto Press in 2005, The Origins of the Slavic Nations, Pre-Modern Identities in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus from Cambridge University Press in 2006. Ukraine and Russia, Representations of the Past, that's University of Toronto Press in 2008. Yalta, The Price of Peace from Penguin, 2011. The Cossack Myth, History and Nationhood in the Age of Empires from Cambridge University Press in 2012. The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union from Hachette UK in 2015. The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine from Basic Books in 2015. Chernobyl, The History of a Nuclear Catastrophe, also from Basic Books in 2018. Forgotten Bastards of the Eastern Front, American Airmen Behind the Soviet Lines and the Collapse of the Grand Alliance from Oxford University Press in 2019. The Front Line, Essays on Ukraine's Past and Present from Harvard University Research Institute in 2021. Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis from Norton in 2021. Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters, again from Norton, also in 2022. And then finally, his most recent book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, which was published by Norton in 2023. Professor Plokhii's books have won numerous awards, including the Bally Gifford Prize, the Lionel Gelber Prize, the Antonovich Foundation Award, and the Shevchenko National Prize. And his books have been translated into at least 15 languages, including Greek, Korean, Chinese, and Spanish. Professor Plokhii's peer-reviewed articles have appeared in prestigious journals, such as the Journal of Contemporary History, Europe-Asia Studies, Slavic Review, East European Politics and Societies, the Canadian Slavonic Papers, Foreign Affairs, and many more. He is revered for the incredible range of his research interests and the questions he asks, and his ability to translate history for an educated general public. In addition to his unsurpassed scholarly profile, Professor Plokhii is extremely active as a public intellectual, giving interviews to popular press outlets, delivering public lectures, and appearing on podcasts and other new media fora. Commenting on this commitment to public scholarship in an interview with The Ukrainian, Plokhii said, quote, "I believe that history and professional historians have certain obligations to the society in which they live. If they do not understand them, the whole incredibly important field is left open to imposters. Nature does not tolerate a void, and that void will be filled. But this is also my personal choice. It's also an essential part of my profession, of how I see myself as a historian," end quote. And finally, I will mention that in November 2023, Serhii Plokhii was one of several esteemed historians, along with Timothy Snyder and Yaroslav Gritsak, who launched the Ukrainian History Global Initiative, a comprehensive and coordinated effort to put Ukrainian history at the center of global history. The Ukrainian History Global Initiative aims to create a deep history of the lands and and of contemporary Ukraine and the peoples who have inhabited them. So without further ado, it is really such an honor and a pleasure to welcome Professor Serhii Plokhii, who will deliver the keynote address for the 2024 5th Annual Ukrainian Studies Conference at Indiana University. And his keynote address is entitled The Russo-Ukrainian War in Historical Perspective. Dr. Plokhii, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Phillips, for first of all inviting me, and second for this introduction. For those who don't know me or my work, the introduction certainly made it very clear that I am a historian, and my talk is on very current developments. The war that already entered third year, but we don't know when it will end, we don't know how we end. And normally the processes that are happening in front of our eyes are left to different experts and to different disciplines. And I know that those disciplines were well represented at this conference this year. So why as a historian, I decided to, first of all, write on that topic and then think and talk about that as well. It was not an easy choice. I was going back and forth on that, whether I could or should do something like that, like writing a history of our time as it happens in front of our eyes. And eventually I convinced myself that I am maybe not the best qualified person to do that, but my training as a historian provides enough foundation to provide a particular perspective on the developments, and also in that sense help people to understand what is going on. Winston Churchill at some point said that democracy was the worst form of government except every other form of government. And I took Winston Churchill's this statement as an inspiration, and I produced this a sentence saying that, which I put into my book, which says that historians are the worst commentators on contemporary developments except everybody else. And when it comes to the discipline of history, there is a number of things that I found we historians can really offer. One thing is very, very classic thing, and this is the origins of things. The academic history looks at that with some skepticism, but that's what people are, and public in general, whatever our profession is, normally looks to for in history, understanding our today's development. Put in what is happening today in some form of a context and in some form of trajectory. Another thing that historians can do, they can recognize certain things and compare those things with the developments that either happening today or not necessarily happening today, but were happening in the past. And that can be useful as well. And last but not least, we historians, we are trained to deal with what today in contemporary world is called false news and fakes, including deep fakes. So the training of the critique of the source, internal, external critique of the source, this is something that students of history, at least in Ukraine back in the 70s when I was undergrad, that was one of the first things that we were learning as part of the source studies course. So those were my sort of excuses of why I decided to do what I have been doing. And another more than an excuse, but really a reason of get into the field of writing about contemporary developments was that as a historian who studied history of Ukraine, of Eastern Europe, history of Russia, written on the history of the Cold War, I really don't remember in my memory any other war that would be so much wrapped up in history and in bad kind of history. The war, in a matter of speaking, again, we are discussing what is the starting point, whether it's 2014, whether it's 2022, whether we should talk about one single war, or there are two stages of the war, or maybe two separate wars, 2014, 2015, and then the one that started in 2022. But this latest stage, the all-out invasion, in many ways, at least for me, started not on the morning of February 24th, 2022, but really in the middle of summer of the previous year, the year 2021, when Vladimir Putin published under his name the essay, pseudo-historical essay called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And I remember discussions at that time which involved my colleagues both in the United States and also in Ukraine, or what to make out of that essay and the timing of its publication. And one of my colleagues suggested that, well, it was published in, it seems to be late June, early July. It was published at the time when all historians were already on vacation. And it was not so embarrassing to publish a piece that was presented such bad history and such outdated model. But history certainly was a very important motivational factor. The part of Putin's understanding of the world and relations between Russia and Ukraine. And both of them are important parts and important not just pretexts, not just propaganda ploys, but I would say important reasons for this war. Here in the West, it was very difficult really to understand Putin's obsession with history, or indeed the argument that he was making. And another part of the Russian narrative, which was about NATO and the need to react to the NATO expansion, got quite a traction here in the United States. Because it was easier to understand, it was also the narrative that fit the general philosophy of political philosophy of parts of the American political establishment, from the left to the isolationists. So it got a lot of attention. But a few weeks or maybe a month ago, Tucker Carlson, a very well-known personality here in the United States, went to Moscow to interview Vladimir Putin. His key question was why did he start this war? What was the cause of the war? And Tucker Carlson was treated for almost half an hour lecture on Russian and Ukrainian history. The face of Tucker Carlson told everyone who watched it that he was completely out of his depth. But that was true also for probably 99% of the public and American public in general. The argument that probably would sell much better in the US and in the West would be still argument about NATO, would be argument about American quote unquote imperialism. So arguments of that kind. But Putin couldn't help himself. He was talking for 30 minutes about the subjects that Americans knew nothing about and had zero capacity to understand it, which stresses once again the importance of history and historical narratives, and not just misunderstanding, but misuse of history in this current war. Putin's article started with the statement indicating what was the purpose of this pseudo-historical exercise. It stated that for many years, Putin kept repeating that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. And that article was providing a pseudo-historical foundation or argumentation for that position. What Putin was really saying was not that Russians were Ukrainians. What he was saying that Ukrainians were Russians, or that Ukrainians don't exist or are not supposed to exist. And the question is where this, at least for me, the question was where these ideas are coming from. I tracked Putin's statement in that regard from the first time he stated that publicly. That was in the summer of the year 2013. Putin was on trip to Kyiv together with Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Kirill, when he said that, and then he kept repeating that. Well, Putin is whatever, but he is not an original thinker. And the idea of the Russian-Ukrainian unity is certainly not Putin's invention. This is the absolute, the standard position that was taken by the Russian imperial establishment, intellectual establishment, and otherwise, in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. That is what one can find in the memoirs of General Denikin. And we know that Putin is a big admirer of Denikin and read those memoirs. This is something that in a little bit different form we can find in the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, another favorite author of Vladimir Putin. So what we are dealing here is the idea of the tripartite Russian nation, where the little Russians or Ukrainians, along with white Russians or Belarusians, are allowed to speak in a funny way and sing maybe songs that are admired by the rest of the Eastern Slavs, but certainly they don't constitute a nation. A political nation is one, and it is Russian nation. That was the model that was built really after the Polish uprising of 1863, after the rise of the Ukrainian national movement. The formula was created at the same time when Valuyev circular prohibited the publication in Ukrainian, the prohibition that lasted with different modifications for more than 40 years until the year 1905. This is the place, this is the time of the birth of Putin's ideas. I call this war the war that is a 19th century war when it comes to its ideology, a 20th century war when it comes to its tactics, really borrowed from the Red Army playbooks of the mid-20th century, a 21st century war when it comes to the use of technology, in particular drones and sea drones, the Ukrainian know-how in this war. So we have an absolutely bizarre situation where the ideas of the 19th century are being taken and as a basis for the action in the 21st century. And people like Vladimir Lenin or Joseph Stalin are being severely criticized by Putin for the crime that they committed of recognizing the existence of Ukraine and Ukrainian nation. So Putin completely misunderstands, of course, and this narrative completely misunderstands the nature of the revolution and revolutionary change, and the fact that the Bolsheviks stitched together the Russian Empire that fell apart, not only with the help of the force, but also by making concessions to the symbolic, cultural, and otherwise not political concessions to the nations of the former Russian Empire and Ukrainians in particular. The breach between the Russian imperial historiography and thinking and Putin in the late 20th and 21st century, and not just Putin, but good part of Russian cultural, political elite and good part of the Russian population, maybe the majority, maybe not, but significant part. So the bridge between those two eras have been Nobel Prize winner Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And in particular, his text, How We Should Restructure Russia, which was published in millions of copies in 1990. I'm of the generation, and I lived at that time in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union. I know how widespread and how widely discussed that particular paper was, where Solzhenitsyn really emerges as a person who takes the imperial concepts and tries to adapt it to the new conditions of the late Soviet and post-Soviet development. So he doesn't say that Ukrainians don't exist anymore. He says, and doesn't call them little Russians. He talks about them as Ukrainians. But if you think that the nationalism indeed is a political principle, according to which the political borders have to coincide with the cultural and linguistic borders, Solzhenitsyn in that context emerges as really a pan-Russian imperial nationalist, because in the article called How We Should Restructure Russia, he is talking about the political unity called Russia, which would consist out of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians. So when it comes to his political borders, forget his language and his use of the term Ukrainian and pro forma recognition of their independence, he doesn't pass the nationality test as anybody else but the imperial pan-Russian nationalist. The Ukrainian referendum of 1991 came as a huge surprise to Solzhenitsyn. And already in November of 1991, he was first of all writing that the count should be done on the basis of the oblasts, and on that basis, the borders of Ukraine should be drawn. And then it turned out that even in the Crimea, the majority of the voters voted for Ukrainian independence. So by late 1990s, Solzhenitsyn already writes that Russia should take over Donbass, Crimea, and southern Ukraine. So if you look today at the map of Ukraine and territories occupied by Russia, and look at Solzhenitsyn's writings from the late 1990s, the Russian question, Россия в обвале, and so on and so forth. That's the map. Again, the map is not in the writings, but that's the verbal map that is presented by Solzhenitsyn. So that's about the parts of intellectual history that probably can be helpful in understanding the origins and the nature of this war on the Russian side. But of course, it would be simplistic and incorrect to imagine that someone just takes one of Solzhenitsyn's writings and then tries to draw the map, and on the basis of that, really wage the war. But it would be also naive completely to dismiss that. If you think about the Russian preparations for the so-called special military operation, which is what you see, what reigns in the title itself, it's really an imperial colonial operation. If you think about the number of troops that were being prepared, the expectation was that it would be the repetition of the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, or the worst case scenario, the warfare in Donbass. So the Putin and Putin's machine fell to a degree victim to their own misreading of history and misunderstanding of history, where it was claimed that Ukrainians are really Russians, and assumed that Ukrainians were waiting for quote unquote liberation that Russia would bring, because otherwise you would not explain that level of lack of preparation and that sort of expectations of taking Ukraine over a short period of time. So this historical and ideological underpinnings were not only the trigger or the one of the causes of the war and trigger for the war, but also, at least partially, are responsible for Russian miscalculations at the early stage of the war. Let me now switch from history per se, intellectual history or otherwise, to realm of geography and geopolitics, where history also can provide some help and assistance. And in this case, it would be a more recent history, the history of the development of Ukraine and Russia after 1991, and the development also of the post-Soviet space. From already 1990s and mid-1990s, Russian political elites, and in particular, Yevgeny Primakov, who was for a long period of time the head of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, and then Minister of Foreign Affairs, if I'm not mistaken, Prime Minister as well. The concept was formulated about a multipolar world, or at least it became quite central for the Russian thinking and Russian rhetoric about the future of the world. The bipolar world was gone. Certainly, the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. One of the contexts in which that happened was, of course, the disintegration not only of the Soviet outer empire in Eastern Europe, but also the disintegration of the inner empire and emergence of independent Ukraine. Russia, which is not even today part of the 10 largest economies in the world, and certainly wasn't in that category in the 1990s, there was a very clear realization that there is no return to bipolar world, that there is no way of how Russia after 1991 could compete with, either now or in the future, with the United States. So the concept was a multipolar world in which Russia would emerge as one of the poles on par with Europe, European Union, which was extending at that time, but also expanding, but also China that was on the rise. The trick was that for Russia to play that role, it still had to establish control, some form of control over the post-Soviet space and its resources, human, economical, intellectual, and otherwise. And the projects were different. So under Putin, you see already that there is a disappointment in the idea of the Commonwealth of Independent States. Ukraine, that was one of the founding members of the organization, never formally joined it. And there was a search for different forms, including under different names, the idea of the Eurasian Union. The problem was that with Ukraine, the second largest post-Soviet republic, the republic on whose vote for independence the entire Soviet Union fell apart, any dreams about for Russia emerging as another pole in the multipolar world on par with China and European Union were dead. And in that sense, bringing Ukraine under the Russian control was extremely important task. I mentioned at the beginning the discussion of the NATO and NATO expansion and what has been the factor of that in the war. I have personally no doubt that no one in Kremlin was particularly happy about NATO expansion. On the other hand, I don't see any indication that NATO really became any factor in the either start of the war in 2014 or then the start of the all-out aggression against Ukraine in 2022. If you again here I'm putting back again my hat as a historian and try to do something that is a very basic thing that historians are supposed to do. We very often don't do that because that was already done before us. But the major task of a historian is just establish the facts and put them in chronological order. Very simple, not very fancy. So we are not given our doctorates and PhD and candidates of history for establishing or designing chronological tables. But that is important foundation of any historical research. If you look at the events of 2013, 2014, you will very clearly find that the annexation of the Crimea and war in eastern Ukraine and Donbass happened as the result of the toppling in Kyiv of the government of President Yanukovych, who promised Ukrainians for 1 year, maybe more than 1 year, sign an association agreement with European Union. And coming to power, the new government that pledged to sign association agreement with European Union. And the protests started in Ukraine, at least originally, on the issue of association agreement with European Union. So association agreement with European Union, this is not a candidate member status in EU. This is not membership in EU. This is not a map or membership action plan for NATO. This is not a membership in NATO. So Ukraine, under pressure from Russia in the year 2008, received refusal for the membership action plan. In 2008, the question was closed, and Western leaders were telling that again and again to Putin that not in our lifetime Ukraine would be part of NATO. So why association agreement, I will use term lousy association agreement, became such an important factor and trigger and the cause for the war? If you think about Russian integrationist projects under Putin, first formulated by Chubais about the so-called liberal empire, and then more a militarized form of the reestablishing control of the former Russian imperial space, and later under Putin, you will see that the association agreement with European Union was a really bomb under any integrationist project that originated from Moscow. Because any country that signs association agreement with European Union automatically becomes not eligible for joining any other union. So association agreement with European Union meant that Ukrainian ship was leaving the Russian harbor. It wasn't joining the European harbor, yet it was not joining NATO and Euro-Atlantic Alliance, but it was leaving the Russian harbor. And that was the process that certainly Russia tried to stop. The goal from the start was not just Crimea or not just Donbass. The goal was the entire Ukraine. And the model after two Minsk agreements was that the regions of Ukraine, Donbass in particular, de facto controlled by Russia, would be integrated into the Ukrainian constitutional space. And under rewritten constitution would become the instrument through which Russia could actually stop any future attempts on the part of Ukraine to leave the Russian sphere of influence. And once it became clear that waiting for next presidential elections or next parliamentary elections in Ukraine to implement that vision and get Ukraine under new constitution was hopeless, the war in 2022 started. Big hopes, of course, in Moscow was for the election of President Zelensky. And once by December of the year 2019, it became clear that whatever the differences were between Zelensky and Poroshenko, Zelensky is not actually going to rewrite constitution the way how Russia and Putin wanted him. The war didn't become inevitable, but certainly the clock started ticking, leading to this war and to this conflict, because Russia certainly didn't achieve its goals, which was keeping Ukraine under Russian control. Here we see going back to the intellectual history and the way how we can also understand these developments through the prism of history, not post-1991, but deeper 19th and 20th century history. It's very important to keep in mind that the model of the Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same nation, or existence of one Russia and Russian nation and one Russian state, either it's Denikin or it is Solzhenitsyn or it was Putin, it was at the foundation of this first attempts in 2014 and then 2022, and continue to be very important today. The entire Ukraine, or at least eastern and central Ukraine, are the goal. But once this ideas, once these projects, once these models encounter Ukrainian resistance and are met with difficulties or are on the verge of defeat, the plan B emerges. The plan B is Solzhenitsyn's plan B, the ideas that he developed in the 1990s. If entire Ukraine, it's impossible to keep it within the Russian either state or Russian sphere of influence, then Ukraine has to be partitioned. And eastern and southern parts of Ukraine have to be integrated into Russia, the so-called Greater Russia model, like it was Greater Germany model in the year 1938 with the Anschluss of Austria, and then the Sudetenland crisis and taking over the German populated territories in Czechoslovakia and so on and so forth. Except that in the Russian case, they start with the Crimea that is mostly populated by the ethnic Russians, and then, of course, go and extend that into the idea of taking over the either historical Russian lands or the lands that are predominantly today are settled by Russian speakers. Let me now move to another segment of my presentation. So from issue of geopolitics and history, how they interacted in the post-Soviet era, to the question of the war and the impact that it has on this long-lasting ideological concepts. Certain things became obvious already in the first days of the all-out war on Ukraine on the part of Russia, in the certainly in March and April of 2022, and others are becoming more and more clear today. One thing that is very obvious is that the idea of the pan-Russian nation that consists out of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, if it will survive certainly without Ukrainian component. We know what is happening in Ukraine today in terms of attitudes toward Russia. For those who don't know, it's enough to look and follow the news about the Pushkinopad and look at the attitudes and discussions with regard to the Russian culture, and the turn away from Russia is not only obvious, but also it becomes more and more stronger, almost with every missile, with every Shahed attack, with every passing day. I don't see, at least I can't imagine any significant reversal in this regard within the life of this generation and next generation as well. It's very difficult to say what is happening in Russia in terms of the public opinion. We can make guesses more or less educated, But it is, again, difficult for me to imagine that all this coffins that are going into Russia from Ukraine, all those crippled soldiers that are coming back to Russia, delivering exactly to the Russian population the idea that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. Can be whatever message, it can be massaged and manipulated and spinned anyway by the Russian propaganda, but I don't see how it can actually produce any different impression model than the fact that Ukraine is not Russia. Again, I not having particular data or insights in the Russian public opinion that I can interpret with any sort of certainty, I see foundation for this sort of my looking into the future and this projection into the developments of this war and that started in 2014 and continues after 2022. Back in 2013 and 2014, there were some bizarre occurrences in which Zhirinovsky and some other representatives, we now know that they certainly worked for the Russian government, they were not any independent political parties, that they were addressing the governments in East Central Europe, in particular in Poland, asking them whether they would like to partition Ukraine and whether Poland would like to take Galicia back. And it was perceived as a joke. Again, it was coming from Zhirinovsky. Well, what we read today about the Russian military planning for this operation, it doesn't look like that Russia had plans militarily taking over Western Ukraine. Exactly the regions and the areas they were prepared to turn to Hungary or to Poland or to Romania or to any other country. And for me as a historian, this is a very, very interesting and very telling phenomenon. Because back in 1914 and 1915, the Russian troops entered the city of Lviv, called it Lvov, and did that under the banner of the same idea that Putin has today of the pan-Russian idea, liberation of the Russian people from the intrigues, control, and abuse by the Austrian general staff. In 1939 and then back in 1944, the Red Army took over the city of Lviv now under the banner of the reunification of Ukrainian lands as opposed to Russian lands. But it is interesting that Vladimir Putin is not interested in taking Lviv, or at least we don't see clear indications. Transnistria, yes, Odessa, yes, but somehow he is not following in the footsteps not only of Joseph Stalin, but also of Nicholas II, who actually shared the same sort of ideas of what were the limits of Russian world, what were the limits of Russian nation. Well, the reason is the nationalist resistance in Ukraine during the last years of World War II and then after the Second World War. The so-called Banda riots that became a very important part of the Russian propaganda. But now it's very clear it's not just the propaganda, it's a lesson learned that part of Ukraine resists. Well, that lesson, I am sure will be learned and remembered for generations to come after the end of this war. I think I still have maybe 5 minutes to wrap up my presentation. And I will switch now to the fourth and last segment of my talk, which will bring in the global impact of the war. That's what I'm going to talk about. I'll repeat once again. We know how we want this war to end, and we don't know how it will end. But there are, like in the situation with the future or the lack of future of the pan-Russian idea, There are also certain things that we can see in terms of the impact of the war on the global stage that are already happening. One of them is the rebuilding of the transatlantic alliance. The unity between the US and Europe that really was under question was rebuilt and brought back as the result of the mobilization by the Western countries to support Ukraine and help Ukraine in this war. This year in the United States is a year of elections. We know that this unity, American, not just Ukrainian, but also American European unity is under big question. But I overall remain to be optimistic in terms of the survival of that transatlantic alliance that reemerged in the context of the war, with particular also realignment within the alliance itself. With US appearing a leader one day and then really a country that on which you can count the next day, what we see is that Europe moves in the position of the first of all leadership in this alliance, and second starts to rely more and more on its own resources, with Boris Johnson appearing really the cheerleader for the alliance in the first stages of the war, and now Macron trying to take that position to fill that niche as well. We see certainly much stronger commitment to the spending on the defense and strategic thinking in Europe as a whole. So this is already a very clear change. Another change that is also very obvious is no matter how you spin Russian performance in this war, there is no question that Russia already is and will probably appear much weaker from this war than it started it. Certainly, the idea of the Russia becoming a pole in the multipolar world is in serious trouble, as China moves into what used to be a Russian backyard and offering the guarantees, security guarantees to countries like Kazakhstan. And I am sure that they are not security guarantees vis-a-vis NATO or the United States of America. This is with regard to Russia. We see the countries like Sweden that for more than 200 years remained to be independent, abandoning, so not independent, but neutral, abandoning their neutrality and joining NATO, and Finland as well, dramatically increasing the front line between NATO countries and Russia. This happens not only because Russia demonstrated that it is a real threat to smaller countries in its neighborhood. This is happening also because those countries think that now is the right moment to join NATO and assure their security, because Russia is weak today and it can't retaliate in the way how it would retaliate otherwise. We also see Russia moving much more closer to China than it was before, and emerging as a junior partner in that alliance between Beijing and Moscow, rather than an independent center, how it was imagined by Primakov and others since 1990s. So the multipolar world with Russia becoming part of it is probably not happening anytime soon. And the tendency has been so far really towards the reemergence of the bipolar world, with now Beijing and Washington being the two poles. And this is the tendency. We don't know whether that scenario will really will be realized, and there is more questions in that regard toward Washington than there are questions toward Beijing. I will stop here on hopefully an optimistic note. Again, bringing my expertise as a historian into the picture. The war that is happening today in Ukraine is the largest war in Europe since 1945. If you don't count the number of the Chinese troops on the front lines of the Korean War, it's also the largest war in the world since 1945. There are new technologies. There are new threats coming with the occupation of the nuclear sites, including the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. But there are also some features that are very, very clear and recognizable for any historian of the decolonization and the fall of the European empires. We all hoped in 1991 that the largest territorial empire in the world, Russian Empire, and then its successor, the Soviet Union, would disintegrate without a major war. Those hopes turned out to be not realistic. But in general, we know what happens as the empires fall. A new state emerged victorious on their ruins, and sooner or later the former metropolis, through the wars and other cataclysms, but they learned to live without empires and live on their own. So broadly speaking, the history of the 20th century, in which no great power really, or very rarely the great power, won a war against much weaker national liberation movement, these broad historical trends are on the side of Ukraine and are on the side of international order as it exists today. But these are long-term trends, and what is really very important to us is a short-term perspective and victory of Ukraine as soon as possible. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Plokhii, for this absolutely brilliant lecture. We do have about half an hour for question and answer and discussion, so let's launch that right away. I see Mikhailo Hanchar, your hand is up. Would you like to contribute?
Пане Сергію, дякую за...
Yeah, Serhii, thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. I just finalized the reading of your monography, The Gates of Europe. So I have a short question. You said that Putin is was interested in Denikin's works. But I had the very specific understanding that the modern Russian authorities don't like losers like Denikin and like the white were considered to be. Why do you think that Denikin is an ideal for them? Thank you.
May I answer in Ukrainian?
Sure, no problem.
It's okay. Our interpreters are still with us. Okay, good.
Yes.
Пане Михайло, дякую.
Mikhailo, thank you so much. Thank you for this question. Well, first and foremost, I have, well, not only I, we all have certain information about what Putin used to read or reads now. Partially it is out from Peskov, partially we get to know it from other correspondents whom he spoke with, and I describe this episode when in my other book, which has the name The Lost Kingdom in Ukrainian translation, which describes these conversations between Putin and a journalist. And he recommends her to read Denikin's works. But Denikin, in fact, retells Alexander Pushkin, who was writing during the Polish uprising of 1830 about the French and the Europe. Don't interfere into the argument between the Slavs. So Denikin rephrased it about Russia and Ukraine. So we have certain information about what Putin reads, and they really impress him a lot. But the most important thing is whether he is reading or not reading, but this narrative is fully represented in his statements, in his speeches, and altogether in his approach. Putin's position is the following. He is looking at communism and communist period in the history of Russia or ex-Russian Empire as, in fact, the dead-end way of development, which led only to certain issues in Russia. So he doesn't follow Solzhenitsyn in this understanding. And here he needs to find some directions for his generation, which was totally disoriented after the split of the Soviet Union. And it is found in Russian Empire historiography or the emigrants' philosophy, like Ilyin. Timothy Snyder was writing a lot about Ilyin and his influence upon Putin and the people who surround him. So in fact, they take it as a new ideological compass. The empire approaches and narratives of the end of the 19th, early 20th century. In this understanding, they refuse from communism, which had to acknowledge the existence of other Slavic nations, as a structure which created this federalism. Even if we look today at the federal structure of so-called Russian Federation, the national minorities do not have any specific rights in comparison with Kursk region. It's not only one of the lessons of the Soviet past, or the split of the Soviet Union, but also the full deviation from the practices connected with that. So this is the substantiation to my comments about where Putin is at, what Putinism is about, and the part of Russian establishment which ideologically is engaged where they are at in comparison with the communist or empire Russian approach. Thank you.
Colleagues, please, your questions, comments, please use the raise hand function.
Okay, it looks like it was crystal clear.
We're all in agreement.
Yes, it looks like. It looks
Looks
like.
like. Please, colleagues, what are your questions, thoughts, provocations?
I know that it was a long day, more than long day, long 2 days. And and in Kyiv it's now what, probably 10 or almost 10?
Almost 9 o'clock.
Okay, almost
Yes,
9.
yes. Yes, please, Oksana Smorzhevska, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Serhii, I would really like to thank you for this comprehensive approach to the problematics. I can really feel this approach of the historian. So I have such a question. It's obviously that for China, Russia is the backyard. I wouldn't say that it's a backyard, it's a kind of the tamed dog, which you can use to accomplish some of the bad intentions. So could you please develop this metaphor of the backyard in more details? What do you mean specifically? Thank you. Thank you. The term backyard is being used, and I hope that it was like that, about Middle Asia as the backyard of Russia, which is now China is interfering in, not only economically, but also from the geopolitical point of view. And I was speaking about also the guarantees of Kazakhstan. But speaking about the relations between Russia and China, it's a very interesting situation. On the one hand, as a historian, it really reminds me the first decade of the Cold War, the 50s. and the Chinese Soviet Union, which was not very long, existed for not that long, because China turned out to be more nationalistic than communistic in its approach. And it was not ready to perceive a dictatorship or the Kremlin domination. The today's union between China and Russia is limited by structure and limited by chronologically. By structure, in the understanding that the most important issue for China today is the economic issue, which started in China itself. For China, it really needs to preserve the international order, the world order, how it is, and the economic links and connections with the United States and Europe.
Путін до певної міри Китаю
And Putin created some mess for China because China was on its way when Europe had been, splitting from US in terms of the economic policy. I mean, now the Europeans are not that fluent in mentioning that to United States, like, please do not interfere, will be developing our relationship with China, because that's economically very important partner for China, for Europe. Now the war in Ukraine has created a unity which is not in favor of China. So China is an ally to Russia, but attempts to help, but while not violating the sanctions already imposed, because this would be painful against the economy of China should they hit. On the other hand, Russia is good for China because it takes away some of the attention of the West to take some of the resources. Also, Russia is good as the supplier of oil, energy, and other resources, and currently China is buying that at a very low price, or at least with a significant discount. So that kind of a weak ally is surely in the interests of China. The continuation of the war, well, it's not very favorable to China because it will consolidate the West. These are the limitations that exists in terms of this relationship of allies or allied relationship between China and Russia. As for the chronology, sooner or later there will be territorial disputes between Russia and China. The so-called agreements, well, these unfair agreements, well, during Mao, China considered part of Russia's territory as their own, and now they're printing new maps and giving Chinese names to some of the Russian territories. I don't think this conflict will unveil within another 5 to 10 years, because there will be other factors in favor of further cooperation between Beijing and Moscow. But I have no doubts that this is a matter of time, that there will be a situation, but I wouldn't consider that as a factor that would impact the current war. Thank you for the answer.
Thank you so much. Mikhailo Honchar, you have another comment or question, and then Russell Valentino.
Дякую, колеги, що
Yes, thank you for giving me a chance to talk to historian. So, Serhii, could you please tell us? There's two expressions in Russia that become very popular. Well, we never lived good, so let's not start trying to do that. And then there is a second impression: there's no money, but you hold on. Before 2014, Russia was demonstrating some serious dynamics in terms of the economic development. Well, surely that was thanks to oil and other resources, and then at certain moment it kind of stopped, and the militarization policy intensified. But why? Why couldn't be wealthy and good Russians? Why should you send them to gulags and make them, kind of loners? Why is there this grieves that someone is not respecting us? Where are all of those kind of statements are coming from? I mean, we understand that Putin is willing to become a part of the international history. He already became that, well, even before the invasion to Ukraine. So, but then he starts the war that may turn into a third world war, and so he might be at the same level as Hitler. So why is all of that? Well, the overall comment as the expert in history, as a rule, those who start the World War never intend to do so. So Hitler was trying to get Poland as well as the Czech Republic. He wasn't planning to start the World War. Putin was planning a special military operation. So all of them were kind of committed some miscalculations. So this is not something that was planned. But I think this is the question that was something that was on top of your comments, but there's two more explanations that I was willing to give. First, we all have, including the historians, we all need to be very serious about history. I'm part of the generation that remembers the euphoria of 1990, 1991, Yeltsin, tanks, the coup in Moscow, the Moscow and St. Petersburg, and the expectations that the cancellation of communists can turn the country into a democratic one. But then we understand how naive we were, because we were not considering the history. The countries, they have their own historical nature, and Russia, from the very beginning, it existed as an empire. That was and that remained a very important part of the Russian psychology. So Putin, in addition to many other things, he's also a politician. He tries to play, some strings that produce the sound that he want to get from the Russian population. Well, particularly early in his first terms as a president. So, kind of being deprived of the empire is very painful for the empires. And unfortunately, Russians are not the only example. The Osman's empire, the Turkish empire, took hundreds of years to get destroyed, the same as other empires. So this is something that is a long-term aspect, and the only thing it might change is the defeat. I mean, military defeat, the loss of Ireland, the loss of Balkans for the Turkish Empire. So that's one of the reasons why not to leave normally, why to continue fighting. As for the second thing, I would refer to some rather arguments rather than historical parallels. The arguments by Briev, the leading expert in economy. He is originally from Kiev. Before that, he was in Russia, and then he moved to Europe. He suggests a very interesting figure where he explains all those things from the standpoint of economy. The Putin's coming to power in 2000s coincides with the price raise for oil and gas, and also from with the economic reforms that were starting with Yeltsin. So the first decade of the 21st century, it was the best economic time in the history of Russia over the past, I don't know, 150 years. So that produced some expectations of the further development, but that was not happening because Putin started decelerating reforms, because further reforms would mean political weakening of the central executive authorities, including the presidential authorities. So he could see that with the reduction of the economic development, well, that automatically results in Putin ratings. So then the war should be started. The Crimea produced a result that Putin could even couldn't even expect. So the economy was not developing, since as the people would be expecting to have after the first decade of the Putin's rule, but the ratings were still extremely high. Then there was a 2-week special military operation. It should be giving, well, finally it produced the results and returned Crimea. So that was the explanation of Beria from the economic standpoint, and I believe this is one of several possible explanations. So thank you.
Thank you, Serhii. And we turn now to Russell Valentino.
Yes, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I have just a question about one of the comments that you made afterward, your comment especially about the post-Soviet political elite, people like Putin and his ilk, going back to imperial ideas from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. There is a parallel in the arts world, very similar, sort of seeing the Soviet experiment as a rather wrong turn. And in the late post-Soviet years, they also, many artists turned back to the late 19th and early 20th century modernism, basically for their inspiration, for models of how to do what it is that they wanted to do. But that was, I'm more interested in Ukrainian ideas, and where you see, especially in historical terms, where you see Ukraine today looking for its models. Is it also turning to the late 19th and early 20th century for its models, or is it looking elsewhere? Where do you see those models coming from primarily?
Yes, thank you. It's and comment on what is happening, that parallels in the art world are very interesting. I never thought about that. Well, Ukraine and Russia are roughly in the same situation in the late 80s and early 90s. For the big mass of the population, and I would say that probably that was a significant proportion, not just in Russia, but also in Ukraine. The collapse of communism is also a collapse of a particular system, not just ideological, but also value system. And there is a search for something new. And this is the time when the missionaries from North America are bringing tens of thousands of people to the sport arenas, where there is interest in religion. So people are looking for alternatives, and elites are also looking for alternatives. And those elites who think about in nation state and in terms of the state culture, intellectual tradition, they go to the same place, allegedly. That place called is non-communist thought, pre-communist thought. In Ukraine, they're going to pre-1917 or 1920s, the period of the cultural revival. Or in Western Ukraine, in Galicia, they go back to the pre-1939 history. Things are being reprinted, republished. That's the only stuff that you could find in Ukraine in the early 1990s. The books on history and literature written by emigres. Brushevsky is being republished in hundreds of thousands of copies. The difference is that when Russians go back to pre-1917, they find Russian imperial thought. They found Nicholas II, they found Denikin. When Ukrainians go to pre-communist part, they found some elements and most of the time of the liberal nationalism. There is also Dontsov and Ukrainian radical nationalism, but it gets traction only in parts of Ukraine. But most of that, this is basically a liberal Ukrainian national project. And elites embrace Mikhailo Hrushevsky as the first president of Ukraine. He wasn't president of Ukraine, but it didn't matter. They were all looking for legitimacy. They found it in Hrushevsky, in Hrushevsky's writings. Hrushevsky was a liberal nationalist, not imperialist, not imperial nationalist. What Ukrainian elites had to deal with when they found this pre-Soviet or non-Soviet legacy was the question that Ukraine of 1991 was not anymore as homogeneous in ethnic and linguistic terms as was Ukraine of 1917. The urbanization came with mass Russification and so on and so forth. And the question was how to build nation using the tradition from 1917 on the foundations of 1991. And that became a major challenge. And what we see in the war of 2014-2022, that this political nation that probably few people believe that existed, it's actually turned out to be quite strong, because all the images that appeared here in the West about the Ukrainians marching with Ukrainian flags against the Russian tanks, they come from the southern and eastern Ukraine, from the mostly Russian-speaking cities and settlements, where the national identity was not about language, right? So that's what the Ukrainian intellectual elites, political elites had to deal with, debated, tried after 1991. So they used the pre-1917 mostly liberal nationalist project, but they had to adjust it to the new conditions, cultural, social, and otherwise.
That's fascinating. Thank you. That was a great question, Russell. Unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap up. Professor Plokhii, we want to thank you for your keynote lecture. It seems to me this was the perfect capstone for our 3-day conference, which has very much taken an interdisciplinary approach to looking at Ukrainian history, national identity, to looking at issues of imperialism, looking at decolonization of Ukrainian history, culture, literature, the arts. And so thank you so much for bringing your insights to us and sharing your time and your expertise with us.